we had shelters in the playground, and they were big shelters with just one door, with no windows, because they would have been blown out with a blast if there was a bomb. But the animals used to get in and out of there and make a terrible mess, and we hated going in there. We had to go in there for practices sometimes, just to make sure we all knew where to go, but we hated it because it smelt so bad. But fortunately, we didn't have a raid during the time we were in school, so we never had to use it seriously.
And one particularly nasty raid was when a whole row of houses in Leesland Road were bombed, and their gardens adjoined our gardens, so it was that close. My dad was an air raid warden, and at that time he was round the front of the house in Norman Road, and he heard the whistle of the bomb coming down, and he ran for all he was worth to the shelter and jumped from the door of the shelter onto the floor. My mum, realising what was happening, threw herself over me to protect me. My two brothers were in the bunk bed on the other side of the shelter. One brother didn't even wake up. He slept through the whole lot. But it was very, very frightening. All the noise, the guns, the bombs, and when a bomb dropped, the whole ground shook like an earthquake. For us, at our ages, it was very, very frightening.
Things to eat were very short supply. There were all strange things like stuffed marrows and hearts and things which are horrible. But I did like corned beef, and I did like powdered egg, which was very good. But as a little boy, of course, you liked sweets, and I think it was something like you were allowed something like 8 ounces a week, which was just a little bar. And we'd been to the pictures, and I'd been allowed to buy a bar of nugget. And it was wet and windy, so I had a raincoat on with buttons down the front and a belt, and my gloves on a bit of string through. And I'm trying to get this off, and I put my nugget on the settee, and the dog ate it, paper and all.
I spent most of the war in the army. From 1940, before that, I was working at HMS Daedalus, building HMS Daedalus. Then I got called up in the army in 1940, and I spent 1940 to the end of the war in the army. I had a job to do in France. After we landed, the landing was successful, and then we moved on, fighting through Normandy, and we were losing the odd man occasionally here and there. And so that was a sad thing, to lose men as we walked through. And we fought right through Normandy, and then we moved to Holland, and we did a lot of fighting in Holland, a lot of jobs in Holland. And then eventually we moved and crossed the Rhine into Germany. So my mum lived in Gosport. My dad was in the Navy, but he was stationed in Clarence Yard, so he was near home. But I had a brother who was in the Navy, and he was in Mediterranean, so he was fighting as well. So it must have left my parents a little bit worried.
I was playing in the back garden when my dad came out into the garden and said, "The war's over, the war's over." And all the hooters and horns were going from the ships in Portsmouth Harbour. All the church bells were going, and everyone was so happy. My dad said I could press the horn on the lorry that was in the yard, and I just stood there with my hand on the horn. And remembering it now, I can get very emotional, but at the time we weren't quite sure, other than the bombing had stopped. And that is what, as children, we thought about.
The first knowledge I had that the war was over, it was a fine May evening, and in those days, bedtime was bedtime. Didn't matter what was happening, and I'd been sent up to bed, and it was still daylight because it was long days then. And my mother called up the stairs and said, "The war is over." And I remember thinking, oh, that's all right then. But of course it was much greater relief to the grown-ups, because they were the ones that were more aware of the stresses and strains. To us, it had been quite an exciting time, really, you know, especially with the D-Day preparations. But then we gradually got to know that there was going to be a party. So that's how we felt about that.
When the war finished, we went back into Germany, and I was employed pulling blown up bridges out of canals so they could use the canals. And then I picked up a germ and got jaundice and was sent home to England in hospital.
So I hadn't seen my dad for 2 or 3 years, and I suddenly woke up one morning and there was this strange man in the room. And the war was over and my dad had come home. So the next thing we knew, we were organising a VE Day party, street party. But unfortunately on the day that we were going to have it, it was very overcast and threatening with rain. So my dad went off to Christchurch Institute, where he was a choir boy, to see if we could hire the hall, but it wasn't available. So then he went to the Methodist Church in Stoke Road, and we had the party there. One of the things was fancy dress, which was all made up with bits and bobs that you found at home. So we had a very nice nurse and a very nice medical orderly with a pith helmet and a Red Cross bag. And my friend Edward came as General Eisenhower with an American hat and a bush shirt. And I was Montgomery. I had a black beret with 2 badges on and a moustache made of soot from up the chimney.
VE Day itself was the 8th of May, but the parties didn't actually happen immediately, because we'd had food rationing and we couldn't actually make a whole lot of food, or the mums couldn't get lots of food up together instantly. So they all got together and tried to work out who was going to supply what as best they could. Things like fish paste sandwiches and spam, and I used to have to be sent round to the butcher's with a bowl of wet liquid, which was the jelly, to get him to set, because we didn't have fridges in those days, so everything was fresh food as such, and people were making cakes with whatever they could find. Eggs were rationed, so that was a limit on normal cakes and things. Most of it was sandwiches and stuff. And then, of course, they all decided that they were going to get the tables out of the houses and put them up together. And Somehow they managed to sort out some bunting going from one right across the road, which is very exciting to see that from one side of the road to the other. We didn't have fancy dress, but we did actually make hats, which with paper hats, which they used to put V for victory on, and then we had a big photograph was taken. We had a bike race, and the race had to be the slowest person. So the winner was the last one across the line. Needless to say, there wasn't a winner because we all fell off.
It was jellies, which were wonderful in those days. We didn't know any different. Cakes made by everyone that lived in that street would make cakes, or if they had perhaps a tin of corned beef at the back of their cupboard that they were saving for some special deal, and everyone without exception donated to that party. The paper hats were normally homemade because there was no special paper to make them with, and it was just one jolly big party. Another thing I remember is when the war was over, a lot of people thought rationing was going to stop just like that, but it didn't. It went on, and I think 1953, the last thing was to come off ration, I think, was sweets, which for us as children was very important. We didn't know what a banana was. Well, we knew what it was, but we didn't know what it tasted like or anything, because all the ships, the merchant ships that were bringing that sort of thing over from these foreign countries were sunk. They were torpedoed, ever so many of them were, and a coconut, never knew what a coconut was until after the war. And I think it was in our area, I think it was someone that came back from the war from one of those countries, and that was the first time I saw one.